The original Persona 3, or at the very least the PlayStation Portable version I played, is one of my favorite games of all time. I can absolutely say the same for Persona 4 and 5, but 3 was different. In certain areas, it had some of the highest highs in the entire series, having some of my favorite characters and one of the best video game endings I've experienced. But that came with a lot of caveats as well. Being the first of its kind, it also has a lot of drawbacks, mostly in the gameplay but also in its pacing. So, when a remake of Persona 3 was announced last year, I was a little bit annoyed considering I literally just played it for the first time, but for the most part, I was excited. Persona 3 had the potential to be my favorite in the series, so a supposed remake fixing all the problems I had with it could potentially make it my favorite Persona game. So, now that it's out and I played it to completion, did it fulfill what I wanted out of the game? And that is what I'm going to talk about today. I should mention something before we start though. Persona 3 Reload is a very faithful remake, and that is of course good. I wouldn't want them changing something I really liked in the original. But that also means a lot of the stuff I thought about the original are present in Reload. I also made a video on Persona 3 last year that covered all of my opinions on it. Unlike some of the other games I've covered on this channel, my opinion on this game hasn't really changed since I made that video. So, to avoid repeating myself, I'm only going to be covering the changes that Reload adds, rather than talking about the entire game again. If you want to see that video, I'll have a link in the description. With that being said, although I'm not talking about the story in full, I will be making this with the assumption that you've played the game in its entirety. There will be scattered spoilers throughout, so be warned. If you liked the video here today, please like and subscribe for more Persona content in the future. And now, let's get into it. Tartarus is the main dungeon you'll be exploring across the entire game, and originally it was pretty weak. Unlike the dungeons in 4 and 5, Tartarus felt pretty monotonous. It was way too big and you explored it across the entire game, and since there wasn't much variety between the floors, it began to feel like a chore, and it just wasn't a very enjoyable experience. And going into Reload, I didn't really know what was going to change. I didn't know what they could change to make it more enjoyable, and I didn't want them to just completely do something different, as how Tartarus works is very key to the narrative and the gameplay. Luckily, Reload does a really good job with Tartarus. Technically, the floors are a little larger this time, but you also get a dash move that lets you go through the floors much quicker. This felt a lot more natural compared to slowly walking through Tartarus in the original. Unsurprisingly, the environments in Tartarus stand out a lot more in the remake too. The graphical upgrade is definitely a factor here, but I also would attribute it to the new camera angle you have while exploring Tartarus. Reload's camera angle is much more at the level of your characters, rather than being at a pseudo bird's eye view. The new camera angle helps the environments pop out a lot more, and it makes you feel like you're actually exploring a real location rather than just moving around on a grid. There is also simply just more stuff to do while you're in Tartarus. There are 3 different types of chests that you can open. There is of course your basic chest, but there is also a rare version of that, and a chest that you need a certain collectible to be able to open. These collectibles are called Twilight Fragments. You can get them by random, or by fulfilling certain requirements for your Velvet Room attendant Elizabeth. There are some crystal formations that you can break while you're exploring to potentially get some items out of it too, so you get more stuff while you're walking around. This offers a lot more reason for me to want to fully explore every floor, because now, instead of just looking for shadows to get my characters up to the level they need to be, I'm paying much more attention to chests and items now because they're actually useful, and not because I accidentally found one while trying to fight the next enemy. There is also more variety in the types of floors you can encounter. I would probably say the biggest addition are monad doors. These doors can appear at random at any floor while you're exploring Tartarus. Behind them, there lies a mini-boss. Yes, if there wasn't already a large amount of bosses already, you can fight more of them if you want. These encounters will get you items if you manage to win, in addition to having more experience won out of the fight because it's a more powerful enemy. They offer a fun challenge and they're absolutely worth doing, because in my opinion, and I'm sure many of you will agree, it's better to have less encounters but with a more challenging enemy, rather than having more encounters with a lesser enemy. Monad doors just help Tartarus expeditions go by more efficiently. After clearing one of these, it'll immediately scope out the entire map of not just the floor you're on, but the floor after, so if you want to skip ahead, you can do so. And if you see the location of something valuable, you can immediately go to it, rather than just exploring the entire floor. There is also a variation of the Monad door that occurs at the end of every block of Tartarus, that includes more bosses, and if you beat them, you will get more reward options after doing the Shuffle Time minigame. The other new type of floor is a golden hand chase. When you arrive at this floor, you see a really large version of a golden hand stealing some treasure, and Fuka will tell you to go after it. Then you will get some dialogue prompts of you running after it. You're not physically controlling the chase because it's really just a luck-based challenge. You will see the golden hand running away, and then Fuka will ask you which direction you thought they went. There is no way to know, so you just have to guess. You do this 2 more times, and if you're lucky, you spot down the golden hand and get to kill it for a buttload of XP. This is kind of stupid because it's literally just luck if you can track it down, but every correct answer will give you more treasure that you spot down. Even if you don't manage to track it down though, at the very least they don't make you go back to the beginning of the floor to explore it. They let you just go on to the next one. I think this mechanic definitely could have been a lot better than just a simple luck check. Maybe instead of just guessing, you have to pay close attention to the movements of the golden hand and then track it down that way, but it's fine. As it is, it's serviceable. Fuka not coming in with you to Tartarus makes a lot more sense here too, because Reload gives her a lot of new abilities. These can range from having the enemies not be able to spot you, to basically giving them a free heat riser, raising their attack, defense, and agility before an encounter. These new additions to her persona make her a much more valuable part of the combat, instead of just being the person to commentate the battles. Those are the new additions that Reload adds to Tartarus. I would still probably say that Tartarus is my least favorite dungeon in the series, but it's much improved in Reload. I actually had a good amount of fun with it, and that's probably due to all of the features I just laid out. And I think that's a pretty big accomplishment. I've enjoyed the combat of every Persona game I've played. Reload, of course, is no different. Especially in the combat, I can definitely feel the Persona 5 influence. The combat is very heavily stylized, from the menus where you select your move to the animations and victory screens. Reload's combat isn't really a copy of Persona 5's, nor is it too close to the source material. It is definitely a fusion of the 2 different styles with some added features as well. Now, for people that are a big fan of Persona 3, you might be disappointed by an omission of one of the most notable features in terms of what Persona 3 brings to the combat. In the game, party members weren't controlled by the player. Your main character was, but everyone else you'd have to order on what kind of moves you want them to do. This was called the tactics menu. There were presets that you could set for each of your party members that can make them act a certain way, but the decision is up to the AI. People that really liked this feature liked it because it made you feel like your party members were real people acting on their own, rather than you just controlling them. And I saw that a lot of people were disappointed that this feature was, although technically present, was definitely swept to the side in favor of having you have direct control of your party. Now, I can see why some might be upset with this, as it's kind of a defining feature, but for me, I don't really mind it at all. I played Persona 3 last, and not only did I play it last, I played the portable version, which also had you control your party members directly. While writing this script, I was watching some footage over a different version of Persona 3 called FES, just to see the differences it brought to combat. Now, take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt because I haven't played that particular version, but it did add a lot of strategy to every encounter. But on the flip side, it also made a lot of those encounters last longer. And while fighting regular enemies in Persona, I prefer it to be quick and to the point, and save most of the strategy for the boss fights and tougher encounters. I think there's a lot of potential for strategy in the fights, and I think all of the games do this pretty well. However, in my opinion, I don't really think the tactics menu was that big of a loss, and I just feel like it would create a lot of issues, and if you want a really good AI system, it would take a long time. So although I see where people are coming from, I don't think it's a huge loss, and Reload still does a really good job pacing out its battles to begin with. I'm also very surprised to see that backup party members don't get experience after combat, so once again, when you choose choose the party you want to go with, you're likely going to be using them for the rest of the game. However, Reload does have a solution for this that I really enjoyed. When you're very thorough with your exploration of a particular floor in Tartarus, a big clock that you can enter will open up at the end of the floor. Once in it, you can choose a party member that's falling behind on levels to go up to the level of your protagonist once they complete another fight. This is a really great feature. It happens frequent enough to not feel like a rare occurrence, but it doesn't happen too much where it would end up feeling like Persona 5 system with an extra step. This allowed me to try out all the party members' movesets. Obviously, since I can't use it on everyone, people like Ken and Koromaru flew by the wayside, but it allowed me to safely use everyone else in addition to my main party of Mitsuru, Yukari, and Aigis. I think this was definitely the best mechanic for Persona 3. In the game, your backup party members stay in the lobby, and there aren't really shadows that attack in there, so it wouldn't make sense if they just inexplicably got stronger without actually doing anything, and this was the perfect solution to that. Probably the biggest thing that Reload adds to combat are Thurgy abilities. These abilities are basically the replacement for fusion spells from the original game. Fusion spells and Thurgies are both really powerful attacks and are unlocked the same way, by fusing specific personas to unlock the attack. In Reload, they are more heavily pushed on the player, and they work a little bit different. This time around, each of your party members can use Thurgy, and they each have their own unique abilities. Additionally, you can't use them whenever you want. There is a bar that you must fill before you're able to use it. Every character raises the bar in a different way, so it pushes you into using your party members more efficiently. The protagonist Thurgies are much more numerous, as they are the original fusion spells, but now, this time, they aren't really obscure or ridiculously overpowered due to only being able to use them once every so often. The most unsurprising thing about the combat is the addition of the baton pass, or as this game calls it, a shift. This should not be a shock at all. The baton pass was definitely the best addition that 5 brought to his combat. Reload's version is not quite as useful as it was in 5, but some of you might think that's a good thing if you thought the absurd building of power that came with every subsequent baton pass was a bit too overpowered. Reload does not have this. It's just a way to switch party members whenever you knock down an enemy. Speaking of enemies, let's talk about the balancing a little bit. Again, this should not be a shock, but I think the enemies are handled much better. I think the biggest thing that 3 did wrong was having too many enemies that had insta-kill light and dark abilities, and then having those abilities work so much. Maybe I'm just an unlucky player, but when I was playing Portable, I died probably 7 or 8 times because some random enemy just killed my protagonist in one hit because of some ridiculous insta-kill that works way more than it should. I think it's pretty good now because they retooled a lot of the enemies to not have those abilities and give them just regular light and dark skills. Not to say I still don't find it annoying when some enemy I'd normally be able to kill easily just randomly throws an insta-kill at me, but it doesn't happen nearly as much as it did. Bosses have also been tinkered with. Almost all of the Full Moon and Strega bosses have been redone in Reload and are definitely much better than the original fights. The biggest improvement by far is Strega, who actually have a decent amount of health and defense this time instead of just rolling over like puppies. I'm not saying all of the boss fights were stellar, as I'm still not that big of a fan of the Lovers Arcana boss fight, and the bosses you fight in Tartarus are still pretty uninteresting, but at the very least they were all an improvement and generally fun encounters. And that is about everything new that Reload brings to the combat. Persona definitely has my favorite combat system in any turn-based RPG that I've played, so it really shouldn't come as any surprise that I enjoyed it in Reload. Although some might argue that it borrows too much from Persona 5, I really could not agree. It added a lot of stuff that I really liked while still feeling distinctly Persona 3. Like I said at the beginning of the video, my opinion of the core narrative is the exact same from when I first played it. The story of 3 is one of my favorites in any game I've played, and Reload is very faithful to that. It's not a shot-for-shot retelling though, as Reload does make some changes in order to try to make it better. For one, the main villains, Strega, get their own storyline in an attempt to develop them further and hopefully make them a more interesting antagonist as a result. Strega was definitely the weakest villain group in the series, and I appreciate that Reload at least tries to make their more two-dimensional traits have more depth and meaning behind it. This attempt goes through Strega's leader, Takaya, as he will have more interactions with the main protagonist, which admittedly does give him more of a presence, but it's pretty clear to me that the writers were trying to do the same thing they did so well in Persona 4 and 5, by trying to create a bond between the main character and one of the major villains, making them some of the most respected written characters in the game. However, in Reload, I just don't think this works as well. You already know that Takaya is pretty goofy when you meet him. In fact, you've already seen him shoot somebody, so it's kind of hard for him to be likable. His additional backstory information is fine enough, as it shows the dark side of the Kirijo group and how it created all the members of Strega. But they also try to pull a moral question with the player, which kind of falls flat. During this storyline, Takaya will ask you if you're truly doing the right thing by trying to get rid of the Dark Hour, but there's not really a moral quandary. His reasoning is pretty much the exact same as the original. He tells you you have power, so why would you want to get rid of it? No amount of additional backstory really helps Strega. They're still pretty uninteresting and definitely not the highlight of Persona 3's story, but at the very least I appreciate the attempt. Speaking of Strega, the other important member to talk about is Chidori. Unlike the other more antagonistic members of Strega, Chidori's purpose in the story is a bit different. She has a romance storyline with Junpei, and she is very important for Junpei's character arc. During her time in the story, she helps Junpei realize what he wants to fight for. He has a lot of bravado pretending like he wants to be the hero, but in actuality, he didn't really have anything to fight for, so he felt purposeless. It's a very sweet storyline with a poignant ending that fits in line with the themes of Persona 3. It all ends in November as Strega rescues Chidori out of the hospital after previously being there for several months. The night after, Strega and the members of SEES end up having a battle in which Junpei gets shot, but not wanting to see him die, Chidori uses the last of her Persona's power to transfer her life essence into him, allowing him to live on. It's at this point in the story where Junpei's persona reaches its final form. Instead of just being a more powerful version of his first, Chidori's persona actually fuses with him and they become one. It's a very powerful scene, but sadly the game undercuts it towards the end of the game. Talking to Junpei enough will allow Chidori to actually survive the encounter and be revived in January. Putting the thematic dissonance aside, it's also kinda stupid how they bring her back. The explanation is that Chidori also had her life essence in some flowers that Junpei gave her, which means that after she died, the stuff that was stored in the flower just went back to her. It's kinda dumb. So it's safe to say that I was not really a fan of this when I first played it, and Reload arguably makes it easier. Instead of talking to Junpei on random dates, all you have to do here is progress his side story far enough, and then you buy him the flowers to give to Chidori for the flower shenanigans to happen. To be honest though, even with it being easier in Reload, I don't really mind it as much as I used to. Sure, it's absolutely better for the story if she isn't magically spared, but it isn't story-shattering like I once thought. This outcome is probably not the best to have on your first playthrough, but on a subsequent run, it's not a huge detriment to Junpei's arc, and as much as I might want to deny it, it's kind of nice to have a happy ending with Junpei and Chidori. On the other hand, the main major character death is handled amazingly. The death of Shinjiro Arigaki on October 4th is the catalyst for many of the character's developments for the second half of Persona 3. It's arguably even more impactful in Reload because he's given a lot more screen time in the month he's in SEES. You can have more interaction with him back at the dorm, and he has a brand new storyline in September. It's a really interesting storyline that fleshes out a lot of his backstory. This storyline also heavily features Akihiko and Mitsuru, and the writers did a much better job showing that the three are actual genuine friends than the original ever did. Outside of these backstory elements, the story is about Mitsuru and Akihiko wanting Shinjiro to enroll back in school. Shinjiro knows he doesn't have much time left, so he knows it's pretty much pointless even if he did. Mitsuru and Akihiko obviously don't know this, and they want him to go back to school to fulfill a pact that the three made when they were in middle school. You don't really get anything special outside of a new persona to fuse. Completing this storyline also doesn't have Shinjiro surviving October 4th. All beating it will do will help you understand and grow closer to Shinjiro as a character. No matter how much you talk to him, nothing will change the fact that he will die, but since you are making the choice to see more of his storyline, you can still enjoy the time you have with Shinjiro while he's still alive. And I think that is much more in line with the main message of Persona 3, compared to Portable, where you can just have him fall into a coma instead of dying because you talked to him enough, which made the important character moments of half of the members of SEES feel forced in that version. However, the biggest thing that Persona 3 did wrong with its story was just being boring for its first 30 to 40%. and that's because it was very slow paced. There was a lot of time between missions and it didn't feel like anything was happening in between that time. It dampened my playthrough enough that even when some of the best story content in the series appeared later in the game, it still was my least favorite Persona just because of how slow it starts. But somehow, despite basically not adding any new scenes to this part of the game, the issue was pretty much entirely fixed for me, and the reasoning didn't really have anything to do with the narrative at all. I think I can attribute this to the improvements in presentation, as well as some more social interactions in your free time. The most impressive thing about this remake is just the sheer amount of voice acting. It has by far the most out of all three of the games, because not only are all the main story scenes fully voiced, but so are the social links, which is a first. For the English cast, every member of SEES has a new voice attached to it, and every side character is voiced for the first time. In terms of quality of these voices, it's of course really good. With the main cast, at the very least, the new voices are on par with when they were originally voiced, to the point that no matter which one you preferred, I would understand. Characters like Ken and Fuka, though, are much improved with their delivery, especially with Fuka, who kind of sounded bland and uninteresting in the older version, actually has energy with her voice while still definitely being a shy character. Junpei probably had my favorite of the new performances. His new voice actor did a really good job portraying the charismatic energy that Junpei has, while also really killing it on the more serious parts of his character. Even though all of the main cast is voiced expertly, I was very surprised to see that a lot of my favorites actually came from the social link characters. Pretty much all of them sounded very realistic, much like real people that I could meet, which I know is kind of a given if I'm calling voice acting good, but it's amazing that there really isn't any separation between the voice acting of the side characters and the main characters, in terms of quality. It was so good that it even made me like some characters that I previously didn't really care for. Kenji, Yuko, and Kazushi are some of my favorite characters now, and I attribute that pretty much entirely to the new voices. They even made the little girl character sound like a little girl without making her the most annoying character in the game, and that to me is a massive accomplishment. Every single character, yes, even the Moon Kid, is impeccably voiced and helps to make the setting of Persona 3 feel alive. It's honestly up there with Fire Emblem Three Houses in Witcher 3 for my favorite voice cast. Reload also adds in several optional storylines called linked episodes. There are several of these, one for each of the main male party members, Junpei, Akihiko, Ken, Koromaru, and the previous one I mentioned with Shinjiro, as well as one with Ryoji. These are pretty much the replacement for social links for these characters, as Persona 3 opts not to give the male party members social links. These new linked episodes are pretty much the best of both worlds. You get several chances to interact with the male party members outside the story, while also not taking away any social links. The rewards for doing them are good, and there wasn't a storyline that I disliked, so I think this is a very positive feature. So you might be wondering my point, how does this fix the early game of Persona 3? And the reason is, with all the new stuff they added with linked episodes and the impeccable voice acting, I didn't really care that the story was going along at a slow pace. I was actually enjoying a lot of the side content that filled up the early game, that it really didn't matter. I think with all of that, Persona 3 finally did what 4 and 5 did so well, making your time through the game feel uber important, making you want to experience everything you can with the time you have. Reload is undoubtedly the best way to experience the narrative. If I wanted to make this video longer, I could go into some nitpicks that I have, but those are small potatoes. With the changes and streamlining of the game's script, it makes for an immensely worthwhile experience that I can finally say stands with the other two games. Reload is not a perfect experience, but it brings Persona 3 the much-needed remake it deserves. At this point, I would probably still say that Persona 5 is my favorite of the trilogy, but now having played Reload, Persona 3 is a very close second. And to be honest, if I had played this game before Portable, it probably would be my favorite Persona game. But sadly, it did not happen like that. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you liked Reload as much as I did, and if you didn't, at the very least, you found this video somewhat interesting. This will not be my only video on Reload, as I will make a social link video later on the year, as well as covering the game's DLC after it comes out. But that's pretty much all I have to say for now, so again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time.